tonight's event, we're so excited to be joined by Donna McLean, talking about her book, Small Town Girl, Love, Lies, and the Undercover Police. Donna is a working class writer, activist, and mental health practitioner. She's written for several publications, including The Guardian, The Morning Star, The Independent, and The Telegraph. She's also published several pieces of short fiction, including being featured in the 2020 anthology, The Middle of a Sentence. Small Town Girl is her first book, and it was published last month. So we're really excited, even though we're not sort of right at the beginning of when the book came out. We're still glad to be hosting you as close as possible to that kind of excitement of release. Donna is one of the people who's at the center of the Spike Ops scandal and ongoing inquiry. Small Town Girl is a memoir of her relationship with an undercover officer and the aftermath of that, leading right up until this kind of current ongoing inquiry and reevaluation. So there's a Q&A box for you to post your questions, as well as a chat if you've got any thoughts or responses while we're going, and then we'll take comments and questions towards the end of tonight's talk. If you feel like tweeting, we're also on Twitter at Houseman's Books. We'll be keeping an eye on the chat and on our Twitter as well. And with that, I think I just need to hand over to Donna. So thank you so much for joining us. You can also ask questions anonymously and upvote any that you find particularly interesting. But yeah, welcome.
Thank you. It's so lovely to be with you. I've had such a long relationship with Houseman's, and Houseman's figures quite prominently in the book as well. So it's even better to be here with you tonight. I used to spend quite a lot of time at Houseman's because our campaign group, Police Spies Out of Lives, actually met there for a good couple of years before COVID hit us. So we would be kind of walking through the shop and sitting in your back room on a regular basis. So yeah, it makes it extra special. And I think in terms of timing, you know, the book's been out since February, and it's a good time to reflect on what's happened and how that's gone, and just the whole kind of publishing thing and being in the media. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. But I thought I'd start with a small reading, and then I'll talk a little bit about the process of the book. And then if we've got time, we'll do another reading, and then it'll be time for questions and answers. Okay, so Small Town Girl. And it's kind of funny being here because I've never done a webinar before. So normally I can see lots of faces, but I know you're out there. So hello, and lovely to be with you this evening. Okay, I'm going to start with a little bit of the prologue. So this kind of sets the scene for you. Ramping up speed as we left North London behind, burning along country roads on the sleek black Suzuki. He always drove fast, even in the estate car. He borrowed the cash for his new toy from work, paying it back out of his wages. He bought me all the gear: tight-fitting jacket, gloves, shiny black helmet. You look the part, he said. You're a speed junkie, I teased. I don't touch drugs. My vices are fast bikes and fierce women. Women? Mock indignation. Just you and Susie. You love that bike more than me. No, I love you, darling, more than you will ever know. My hair blowing out from under the motorbike helmet. It was getting long again, and he wanted me to grow it. He liked it when I wore the things he bought me. Huge hoop earrings, long boots, dresses above the knee, designer sunglasses. He was generous. A traditional working class Italian boy. We drove further into the countryside north of London, and he knew all the roads. From when I was working at the locksmith, darling, I did a lot of work in those posh houses. He pulled in beside a shady thicket, kicked down the bike stand, and turning to face me, he lifted his visor and gestured at me to raise mine. I fumbled, still clumsy, not used to my new uniform. He raised it for me, delicately, big hands gentler than they looked. Shall we? Those eyes. He pulled me towards the darkness of the trees and started unzipping my leather jacket. We were moments from a busy road, but I didn't care. I never cared. He could have led me over a cliff edge if he'd wanted to. So that's part of the romantic scene setting. And now I'm going to read you another little section further on. And by this time, I know about the realities of the relationship, or at least some of them. So this chapter is called What is True? Carlo, locksmith, activist, fiancé. Carlo, spy cop, state-sponsored liar, someone else's husband. It's late 2017, and I'm writing down the history of my relationship with Carlo on giant post-it notes, remembering the key events as best I can. This is in preparation for making a police complaint, which is a legal challenge in addition to the civil case I launched in January 2016. As my relationship began after the Human Rights Act came into force in 2000, there are several legal options open to me. The question is, how much do I want to fight, and how much fight do I have in me? I keep returning to the Bologna trip in February 2003. I talked about it for months afterwards, years even, long after Carlo had disappeared. Planning a holiday with my sister, I suggest we go to Italy. You'd love Bologna. We can go to the Donna restaurant, the posh one. Didn't you go there with Carlo? Won't going back upset you? Oh God, no, not after all these years. Bologna is beautiful. And why should I let him ruin it for me? I knew it would hurt though, retracing those steps, those sites of incredible love and passion. The Donna was one of the classic Emilian restaurants. Not great for vegetarians, but I still ate meat back then. It was Carlo's favourite restaurant, or so he said. He'd booked a table. It was so popular you had to book weeks in advance. Before we went, we had several rossinis, which we drank headily in a socialist bar decked out in red from floor to ceiling, close to the Due Torre. Carlo made me go back to the bar to practice my Italian, which was non-existent. I could say, ti amo poi di calcio, and that was it. He planned every moment of the trip, booked the flights, the hotel, and filled our days with a roster of Bologna's best sites. Museums, yes, but also beautiful streets, quiet bars, big events. He'd booked us tickets to see Bologna play football. I'd never been to a match in Europe, and it was a revelation. Armed police, dogs, flares going off everywhere. It was cold, and he wrapped himself around me to keep me warm, extracting himself only when Bologna scored. I love you more than football. He said this to me every day, his working man mantra, although the last part was interchangeable. More than words, more than the sunset over the Isle of Arran. I love you more than wine, more than money, more than the stars up in the sky. Every day. I can't remember if I had a mantra for him too. I remember feelings more than words, images, physical sensations. We stayed in a 5-star hotel, and Carlo insisted on ordering room service at breakfast each day. I'd never had room service before. I laughed and teased him as they wheeled in the cart, plates piled high. Bloody champagne socialist you are. We had left plenty of time in the schedule to stay in bed. On our way to Bologna, the heat and the beauty enticed me. But more than that, it was a chance to be close to him, to his roots. I knew he'd spent so much time there, seeing family that extended out from the heart of the city. I remember how disappointed I felt when he announced that we couldn't go and visit his dad, but he said he wanted this trip to be just for us, celebrating his birthday and Valentine's Day. No family or friends, just me and him. A longer one, he promised. He would introduce me to all the cousins and the aunties who were still alive. I write the words, "not true stories," on one of the giant post-it notes and stick it in the middle of the wall. Then I start to recall. Number 1, Vanessa Phelps. Carlo was a locksmith. Carlo said he did some work for Vanessa Phelps. He described the opulent staircase in the centre of her North London house, with a crystal chandelier hanging above and a huge portrait of Vanessa wearing a flouncy pink dress hanging on the wall. Ostentatious, he called it. Recently, one of the women did an interview with Vanessa Feltz. I wished it had been me, just so I could tell her about Carlo and ask her if she really had a giant portrait of herself on the top landing and a crystal chandelier above the staircase. Just imagine if she'd said yes. Number 2, the Jesus and Mary chain. We were on the London Underground on a Saturday night. I remember changing lines at Oxford Circus from the Bakerloo onto the Victoria line. We were heading south to Stockwell. It was a Saturday night, and we'd been invited to a comrade's birthday party. There must have been a gig on at the Brixton Academy, judging by the swarm of Jesus and Mary chain t-shirts. You must like the Jesus and Mary chain, Carlo had said, being Scottish. I never really listened to them, do you? I love them. April Skies is one of my favourite songs. I have Spotify playing from my phone. I'd change the song. April Skies bursts out of my Bose speaker, and I write down the lyrics on one of the giant notes. Baby, baby, I just can't see just what you mean to me. I'll take my aim and I'll fake my words. I'm just your long time curse. Okay, I'm going to have a little pause from the book, and I'll talk a little bit just about the kind of how the book came about and how I ended up publishing a book, which surprised me, still surprises me to this day. And then maybe we can have some questions, and if we've got time, I'll go back to another section. But originally, I met Carlo in 2002 on an anti-war demonstration. We were, instantly together. We got engaged within 3 months, and we had a really quite glorious time for about a year. And eventually the relationship broke down after 2 years, and this was due to childhood trauma, or so I thought. Carlo appeared to have a breakdown and he disappeared completely from my life. And the last I heard from him was in November 2004. So we were together for just over 2 years. And then it took me a while to get over it. It was quite a traumatic ending to the relationship because he'd been disappearing back and forwards for 6 months. He'd gone missing quite a few times. He claimed he was suicidal, and he once sent me a message when I was at a friend's birthday party in Camberwell saying that he was suicidal, and I had no way of getting hold of him. So there was a lot of distress in the kind of last 6 months of the relationship, and I felt pretty wounded, I would say, when he finally left me. He left me by sending me an email to my work email address. But then, after a couple of years, I moved on. I ended up moving out of London. I had children, and things were, completely different life. And it was a whole decade later, that I got a message out of the blue saying, we need to talk about Carlo. And this was one of the activists I'd known back in the day, one of the people who was on that very first anti-war demonstration in September 2002, which is where Carlo and I met. Although interestingly, we'd actually met before, but Carlo claimed not to remember it. He'd been in my house about 9 months before that day, and he claimed not to remember. He was dropping off some packing boxes that my friend had borrowed. So yeah, that stuck out a little bit, but I didn't question it. He said he'd been in a bad place because his mother had died, so he just couldn't remember. So I left it. So back to 2015, I get this message, and it says we need to talk about Carlo. And there was a kind of feeling that I just thought, I know why we need to talk about Carlo. And the hairs went up on the back of my neck, and they always do that whenever I talk about this. But I'd read the book Undercover by Rob Evans and Paul Lewis, the journalists. And this had catalogued the very beginning of people finding out about spy cops and the original group of 8 women who uncovered spy cops as activists. And then they took a case against the Metropolitan Police, which they, took several years of neither confirm nor deny, and a really difficult legal challenge. But they won their case just as I found out about my untruth or my 2 years of missing life. And that's very much part of the fabric of the story, that it's, this didn't just happen to me, this happened to an awful lot of women. And as we know at the moment, there are at least 50 of us that we're aware of. And the scale, that's the tip of the iceberg. There's so many more people who don't have a clue because of the anonymity of the officers that, they've been given anonymity by the inquiry. So we don't have a clue. But at that point, so I had this huge revelation. And then there were lots of pieces of the jigsaw missing. So I knew a little bit. I knew that he was a cop, but I knew nothing else. As far as I was aware, he'd been a locksmith. He was a left-wing activist locksmith. And then suddenly I found out that my missing 2-year fiancé was actually a married special branch officer. So as you can imagine, that blew my mind slightly. It meant I had to go back and retrace my steps. And it really sort of blew apart what I understood to be the reality and the narrative of my life. So I started to write because the first thing I did was I wrote an article for a trade union journal. I was urged to do this by my good friend Dave Smith. He just said, do it, write it. I said, I haven't written since I was at school, but anyway, I did it. And then I started to feel that writing was a way of kind of getting this crazy story out of my head and onto paper. And it helped me to process it, and it helped me to try and fit together when and what and why and who was who. And from these kind of fragments and memories, it started to form into something that started to look like it could be a book. So I started writing it as a novel, although it was all completely true. And then, at some point later on, someone said to me, well, it's not really a novel, is it? It's a memoir. So why don't you just kind of try and write it, finish it, and publish it as a memoir, which is what I did. Really grateful for the support I've had from so many people. There's lots of people involved in the book who've given me a massive amount of support, and other writers. So this was a very new thing for me, having not really written since I was a teenager. So I was, published a book at almost the age of 50. So I'm very happy and I'm very grateful. And that very first meeting after that message, so the message that I had that said, we need to talk about Carlo, where we actually met up was outside Houseman's bookshop. So there you go. That brings us back to where we are now. So yeah, I'm up for any kind of questions or discussion if you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. Firstly, thank you so much for reading and sharing that with us. We'll wait and see if any questions come in from the audience, but I have a couple to start with. One of the first things that I was thinking about was just how has this experience been? One of the things that you write so evocatively about in the book is the kind of experience of scrutiny that comes with media coverage and that sort of thing. And obviously, you've had a lot of press coverage again around the book. I'm guessing it's probably quite different this time, being under your own name rather than with anonymity. How has this been?
I think I deliberately dropped my anonymity back in, it would be 2 years in the summer, coming up for 2 years. So it was July 2020, and I felt that was something I had to do, really, because it started to feel like a bit of a burden. There was that slightly tentative thing about how are people going to respond? I've got these two lives. So people know me as one thing. They know me as Donna, who works in mental health and used to be a nurse and, does this and does that. And then there's this whole other life. And there's this Andrea person who goes on the telly and writes articles in the newspaper. And it was just, I needed it to come together because I felt it was quite exhausting to carry it. So there was a little bit of publicity around that itself, but it kind of fell neatly into place for me. It felt like a really good, genuine, authentic experience. And that I didn't get a backlash. The thing that I was worried about, it just didn't happen. It was the opposite. There was a real groundswell of support. So I guess with the publicity, in some ways, I was fortunate because I'd done all that press work as Andrea. So I was used to talking. I was used to talking at conferences, used to interviews. So there was a sense of, well, I'm kind of familiar with this, but it was a flurry. It was almost like a whoosh. So I was used to it, but not with that intensity. And I think one of the biggest things really was, it was wonderful. So I've got the most amazing publicists. So the team of people that you work with, your agent, your publisher, your publicist, they were I just got the best trio. And Emma was fantastic. Emma was the one who kind of set up all the publicity stuff. So I was literally going from being on Lorraine on primetime telly to Women's Hour to the kind of BBC 5 Live evening one to BBC Scotland to it was like so that was like a whirlwind, I think. One of the biggest challenges was actually physically being able to do it because I'm a single mum. So in order to do it, I was kind of traveling around the country up and down to London. And I think that was one of the big things. It's like that in itself is a bit of a challenge because you've got to get childcare. And I was doing all sorts of wonderful things and being invited to lovely events whilst I'm getting kind of messages on my phone saying, Mom, I can't access my homework. I'm going to be in trouble tomorrow. I'm like, just breathe. I'm about to go on stage, but yeah, we'll sort it out. So that was another kind of little thing. Fortunately, my sister who lives in Glasgow is wonderful, and she took some time off work to come and help out for a week. Thank God. But the publicity's been great, and I think apart from the fact that when they take photos of you, they always do a massive headshot, and you're like just there with your head, and it's huge, and you're like, God. I'm like, before you read the text, the first thing you see is just a massive close-up of your face, and it's like, can I just avoid looking at that and read the actual blurb? So it's like this, yeah. But it's been wonderful, and I think you kind of come down from that then. So that almost went on for, I'd say, about 3 weeks, and then sort of you come down and you come back to earth a little bit, and it's like back to normal. Thank you. But it was great, and just people have been so supportive, and I'm a huge fan of Twitter. I use Twitter a lot, but I've got this whole kind of supportive community of people that I've met on Twitter, writers and artists, and just people who are lovely. So it's been great.
I guess, and kind of continuing on from that, this is probably a bit of a more writing focused question. I'm so interested in this shift from novel to memoir. You have a really very descriptive and very evocative way of writing, so I can completely see how this book would work as a novel. How different was that process? Like, what was it that changed between calling it a novel and calling it a memoir?
Well, I think the actual change was the issue of anonymity, because I was writing it as a thinly disguised memoir because I had anonymity, and that was the only way I understood it at that point. I hadn't quite made the decision to drop that. So I'd been accepted onto a mentoring program by Penguin. Well, at that point, I'd got through to the final group to be put forward to be mentored by Penguin. And on the very final kind of hurdle of it, so you had to write a bit and then you had to submit it, and then you had to write a bit, submit it. And we went down from 1,700 writers to 10 who were accepted. But this was over a period of time. And when we got to the final hurdle, they rang me up and said, are you willing to write it as a memoir? And I just thought, if I don't say yes, then there's a good chance they're not going to take me. So I was like, I'm just going to throw myself into this, and it's now a memoir. But in reality, I think it was a much better thing to do, because I need part of the process, part of the kind of therapeutic, cathartic process was reclaiming my own truth. So that was actually a huge thing for me to write. Some of the things I've written are probably, they're quite, some of them are tough, some of them are very, they show vulnerability. I give a lot of access to my emotional and physical life in this book, but that was almost like turning the power dynamic on its head, because, what the police tried to do is take away your power. And to kind of own your power, you've got to have this honesty, and it's a kind of vulnerable honesty, because otherwise they've still got stuff on you, haven't they? They've got the stuff. And it's like, if I put my stuff in this book, then I've claimed it and I own it, and you can't do anything and your power is gone. So I think in that sense, it was more, rather than the writing, my writing style hasn't particularly changed, but I think it was more the kind of the approach and the psychological kind of understanding of it for myself. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. And it's such an interesting shift, that writing something like this is so deeply cathartic, but recognizing that it has to be a process of catharsis is not necessarily something that you can get to straight away, if that makes sense. Yeah. We've had a couple of questions come in. One of them is about the kind of end of the relationship with Carlo. And did you ever suspect that he was an undercover officer before this kind of moment of revelation? Was there anything?
Until I read the Undercover book by Rob and Paul, I had no clue whatsoever. I was told, so about 2 years after he'd gone, I went to a birthday party with some old friends, and someone that I'd met who was friends with Carlo, who used to go to football with him, a Scottish guy. He came up and he said, "Oh God, I heard what happened with Carlo. He was such an absolute shit to you." And he said, "But I heard he's gone back to Italy." So he said, "I heard he's gone back to Italy and he had a motorbike accident." I was like, "He survived?" He's like, "He survived." I was like, "Okay." So there was this kind of other story that had been passed around and people understood that he'd gone back to Italy. So I accepted that as the truth because that was, that's what I was told, and nobody at that point, I don't think anyone questioned it. But then when the stories started to emerge, when the Mark Kennedy story broke, and then more stories broke, and then all the other women came forward together and started to work with our lawyer, Harriet, then, that book, Undercover, just showed very clearly the pattern of the relationships. It showed how they were formed. It showed the kind of the behavior within them. And what it definitely showed, the thing that got me the most with that book was the kind of exit strategy. So when I read the book, I had this feeling, and it was like, oh, this just sounds so much like Carlo, the practical, the job, the estate car, the way that there was childhood trauma, the way they do disappearing acts, and then the way that they would ultimately leave due to some kind of terrible event or psychological difficulties. But I couldn't, at that point, I did not get why I would have been part of that, because I couldn't see myself. I didn't think I was an activist. I was just like, well, I'm just like, I work in drug treatment and I'm a trade union rep, okay, but I'm not one of these women who are like really fierce activists. How do I fit into it? So there was this question mark, and a few times I went to send an email to someone from the group because I knew I could contact them, and then I just deleted it. It was like, so I left it hanging for a little while, but then not too long after that, I got a message on Facebook Messenger saying, so that when I got that message, it was just like, I know why I've got this message. I know why you have to talk to me. I know now. I still don't understand why me, but I know that this has happened, and I know what the story is, so, or at least part of it.
And kind of following on from that, we have another question about whether you've heard anything from Carlo or from any of the other people sort of involved in that since the book has come out and since this has all become more public, and especially dropping anonymity. Has that led to any kind of change? Have you heard anything further there?
No, I don't. Well, I mean, Carlo would never in a million years would he come near me. Not to my face anyway. There was a point, and I do write about it in the book, there's a point when I was followed after an event in London, and it was quite sinister. And I'm quite sure it was one of his special branch mates that followed me late at night. And that was, I think the purpose of that was to try and shut me up. So at this point, I just started to talk. I'd started to speak in public. I'd started writing articles. And I think that was a way of trying to freak me out, because I was being followed not surreptitiously at all, but very openly. And it was, it was late, it was dark, it was meant to scare me. So I think that's the closest contact I've had. But in terms of all the other people, what's amazing is one of the whole purposes of Spy Cops and what they set out to do was to disrupt the groups. So they set out to disrupt the activist groups, to plant false information. They went as far as miscarriages of justice. But in the case of our group, it was like everyone came back together. It failed. He failed in his mission completely, because everyone, there was this kind of joining together and people actually being much stronger as a unit than they were before. And I think the sort of some of the tactics that they all used, but Carlo's in particular, so he tried to get some activists to firebomb a charity shop in Maida, which was apparently a cover for a fascist organisation in Italy. So there was this kind of trying to push people to go way beyond their limits, trying to push people to actually do things that were, out with the law. And, he failed on that as well. So the whole mission of disrupting the groups, the whole mission of who knows? I mean, the surveillance is really what it was all about. The surveillance of protests, the surveillance of groups who were on the left. Because I think the other thing to remember is it was people on the left who were targeted. It wasn't people on the right. Out of the 1,000 groups that we know were targeted, 997 were left wing or social justice or left anarchist, and that it just is quite astonishing because meanwhile the right wing were left to run amok. So yeah,
and I mean Houseman's is obviously also part of this history because the shop was one of the kind of organizations that was surveilled in the, I think, 80s and 90s, and so there is this history for us as well, this kind of connection to the way that we've tried to be a space for organizing and within the shop itself, but also within the rest of 5 Cali Road. And we are connected to this history too. And I guess related to that, I'm wondering what some of these kind of physical spaces like Houseman's can do in trying to heal, recover from some of this trauma. And I mean, one of the things that you write about so evocatively in the book is kind of place and geography and the kind of catharsis of writing is one thing, but the trying to reclaim these spaces, and Houseman's I would include in that, is another part of this kind of cathartic process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I did not intend really to write a kind of radical travelogue of London, but there's a little bit of that it sort of just emerges, and the tying things to place, like you say, places are so, we're so rooted in place, and when we start to go back and really excavate our lives and our memories, then places become hugely important, and you can see them, you can smell them, you can feel them. There's a sense of them. I can sense that back room in Houseman's right now. I can physically put myself there. I remember going there and buying Christmas shopping with Carlo, because apparently Carlo worked across the road in Frankie's locksmiths, which was there for years. I think it's shut now, hasn't it?
It's shut, but the shop front is still there. And so reading that mention in the book was like,
long. It was there for so long. And it was this kind of, this, again, it's this space that I totally associate with the story. And so much of it's tied to space and to music. So I've just got this kind of huge playlist because each place has a song attached, each event has a song attached to it. And I think it's it's about that whole picture, isn't it? And it's also about reclaiming stuff like music and culture. And because that feeling when you leave a relationship or a relationship ends, quite often you want to keep as far away from what reminds you of it as possible. But going back was almost reclaiming all of that as well. And the space thing, I think it's very much about having safe spaces for people. It's about having places where people can meet, where people can talk. And the healing thing, I think that comes mainly from peer support. I think for me, the catharsis of writing and then peer support, because people always say, oh, did you have counselling? You must have had counselling after this. And I said, no, I didn't. I walked by the sea. I wrote things down, and the peer support, so having other people around me who completely understood this very, very strange thing, because it's such an unusual thing to happen. That kind of scale of deception is so mind-boggling, and knowing that it was being orchestrated by the state, not by one kind of man who was being unfaithful to his wife, but it was like the entire state has orchestrated this. And they have come into my life knowing they're going to stay there for a couple of years and knowing they're going to leave in the most cold-hearted, malicious and cruel way possible. So you've sort of kind of, that when other people have experienced that, there's an instant bond.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the kind of running threads throughout the book is about how that, yes, there are these relationships kind of at the center of the whole spy cops kind of scandal and the kind of individual romantic relationships, but the threads that come out from that of people who work with these undercover officers and people who meet them at parties and meet them at protests and kind of get drawn into this, even at quite like a degree of remove, there is this very traumatic event there of this deception.
Yeah.
I wonder, and this is probably quite a big question, for people who might have felt a kind of more distant experience of this, you know, who think that they might have been connected to this in some way, not as necessarily as immediately as you, but through colleagues, friends, friend of a partner kind of thing. What do you have any advice for people going through that kind of revelation, any kind of more distant experience as well?
Well, I think it's been interesting that because the book itself, when people who are in that situation, so you've described perfectly a whole group of people on the periphery who've read the book, but it's actually really got to them emotionally. So they've I mean, I've had messages from so many people who are kind of slightly involved, but at, you know, one kind of stage removed. But it brings it all back. It brings so much back, and it brings back stuff in their life that happened at that time. And you know, there would have been people, for example, who, because Carlo spent a lot of time with my work colleagues as well, a lot of time with my family. He obviously spent a lot of time with the activists. He was actually, you know, the groups he was infiltrating, but he spent a lot of intimate time with people. It wasn't just in meetings. It wasn't in some room with lots of chairs. This was in people's houses, you know, over the dinner table. People invited him into their home. He stayed with them. So I think, again, it's the process of talking about it. And I think that's figured quite heavily. So obviously the people who were really heavily involved in the group, but then my family as well. My family were equally having to live through this re-understanding of everything that had happened, because, you know, they had a huge amount of trust in him as well. And that trust extended to a real kind of intimate family setting. So he was there when we planned, you know, my grand's headstone. He was there at my sister's graduation. He looked after my uncle's granddaughter while we sat and worked out details for a funeral. And that's really invading people's lives on some huge level. So you've got the degree to which that happened to me and the degree to which it happened to the activists. And then you've got all these other people as well, people's children. And that's, you know, that's another thing that it spreads quite far. The impact is quite wide. There's a ripple effect.
Absolutely. I was wondering would you like to read some more, and maybe we can have some more questions if that feels comfortable?
I might just read another little short section because my throat's getting a bit ropey again. I've not been very well, so I'm sorry I'm a bit.
In the meantime, if you have any more questions, please pop them in the chat and I'll pass them on.
Okay, so I'm just going to come back to that chapter where I last mentioned the Jesus and Mary chain. So number 3 on my giant Post-it notes. I do actually use giant Post-it notes. This is still a thing. I find them really helpful for planning. Number 3, Ela. Ela says, "Hi." Carlo turned his head slightly so he could see me, cupping his hand over the phone. He winked. Love right back at her. Donna sends her love. She's just in from work. She's had a tough day. I heard her voice, distant, on the other end of the phone. I mouthed at him, "I love you," as I left the room. One of our clients had died the previous day from an esophageal bleed. He was a long-term drinker, an Irish man from Derry. I knew him from when I lived in the squat in Vauxhall. We drank in the same pub where they served the best Guinness in London. Carlo had held me tightly when I cried in bed. Ela was Carlo's older sister. We'd never met. She lived in Peterborough, which she hated, and she was stuck in a deeply unhappy marriage. She felt trapped, she was depressed, and she spent her days drinking tea and smoking in the kitchen. She didn't like visitors. No wonder, I thought. It all sounded grim, especially Peterborough. Carlo didn't paint a flattering picture of the town. You'll get to meet her soon, he promised. He drove up there once or twice a month to see her. She very rarely went out, and they spoke on the phone at least twice a week. I remember my empathy for this fake Ela. The real Ela wasn't depressed at all. She had a successful business and a handsome husband and a beautiful house. I'd found this out on Facebook. It wasn't Ela he spoke to twice a week on the phone, who I shouted hi to. It was a woman, but not his sister. Certainly not his wife. Who was she? I know deep down who she had to be. So I write on the giant post-it note in spiky black letters, lies, police handler. Number 4, Anne. Carlo told me he met Anne, his son's mother, when he did some work on her parents' home. They owned a big house in a civilised North London suburb. He said she was a journalist. She was older than him, and it was a fling that only lasted a few weeks. She got pregnant and wanted the baby, but not Carlo. He said she was difficult, aloof, posh, made it hard for him to see the baby, so in the end he gave up. He told me this fairly early on in some version of Cards on the Table, a talk to start our relationship on an honest footing. He didn't want to say much though, only that he missed his son, hardly saw him. She got in touch a few months into our relationship though, wanted him to get involved. She didn't want money, but she wanted help with childcare as she'd moved to Cornwall and needed to make regular trips back to London for work. She wanted Carlo to stay in her house to take care of the boy when she travelled. Can't she bring him here, Carlo? We can look after him in London if she's not coming up anyway. She won't let you meet him yet, darling. She wants to wait until she knows it's solid between us. Doesn't want different women in and out of his life. Of course we're bloody solid. We're getting married, for God's sake. I know, my darling, but she's a bit difficult. And she's protective of Freddie. That's understandable. She's used to having all the responsibility for him. It's me she doesn't trust, not you. She thinks I'm unreliable. She's the one that messed you around, though. You said you wanted to see him and she kept putting barriers in your way. I know it's not fair, but I want to build a relationship with him. He's going to be a big part of our life. Let's just take it slowly with Anne. Please, Donna, be patient. After that, he started disappearing off every other week, down to Cornwall for the weekend. When he came back, he'd show me photos of the boy, playing on the beach or running in front of him. He glowed with pride, and I suggested again that I go with him. He always said no, and I'd be left asking myself what hold this woman, Anne, had over him. On my final post-it note, I write wife, and I add it to my installation of lies. I look up at the wall of deceit, bright pinks and yellows, drawing my eyes to the lies that dictated my life. I can't bear to look at it anymore. I leave the room and shut the door behind me. I'll come back to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's been really wonderful to have you, and we're just really glad to be talking to you and being able to host these conversations as well. We do still have some of your signed copies in the shop because you were kind enough to pop in and do that for us. So for anyone who doesn't yet have a copy of Small Town Girl, you can come and visit us.
Very impressed because you ordered a load of copies in and I was so happy to see them. There was a huge pile the day that I came in to see.
They've been really popular. We have one last question that's just come in, and unless we have any more, this might be our final one. Do you think that there are still undercover cops in this similar kind of spy cops dynamic out there at the moment?
I think there are still spy cops operating all the time. I couldn't say for a fact that they would be getting into long-term relationships and being undercover for this length of time. So the average kind of deployment for this lot was about 5 years. So they were called deep swimmers. They were undercover for a really long time. So I wouldn't like to think that was still going on, but there will still be undercover police in every part of the protest movement and every part of left-wing politics. Will they be having fleeting relationships? Well, I would guess they might be. I know that it happens in every other area of undercover policing. So if you look at organised crime, if you look at gangs, if you look at drugs, then it's going on there as well. And we're kind of almost like, we're this story, the women who were deceived into these long-term relationships, we are this story. But outside of us, this happens again and again and again. And it really is about institutional misogyny within the police. There is institutional misogyny, there's institutional racism, there's class bias, and there's homophobia as well. And we've seen recently, I mean, I don't have to tell you about what's been in the news recently about the Met. They've not done themselves any publicity favors for quite a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess sort of adjacent to that, when we know that there is this kind of level of institutional violence against so many communities and this level of surveillance, how do we as organizers and activists and participants in these movements kind of try and resist the paranoia that that can bring after these kind of scandals and these kind of stories, and knowing that this is such a kind of common and pervasive act of invasion and violation? It's possible to get kind of sucked into real anxiety and kind of lose some of the solidarity that these movements are built on.
Yeah, I think my experience has been the opposite of that. Quite interestingly, my personal experience has been that, you know, it's about boundaries and it's about safety and it's about people that you trust. And I'm very fortunate that I've been surrounded with people that I trust. And I think it's, you know, my big concern is about legality. It's about the changes in the law that could, you know, that are making it impossible for us to actually do what is a very normal thing to do, to protest against things that are wrong, to protest against, you know, state oppression and brutality. And the fact that the law is trying to take that away from us is the most worrying thing. I think people will there'll always be a level of suspicion and paranoia in groups. I mean, I remember going to a meeting in London with Carlo and someone got asked to leave, but it wasn't Carlo. Carlo was not the person who was asked to leave. So there was someone that they didn't like the look of, but it wasn't him. So, you know, but I think I would not want to live my life in a state of mistrust all the time. I think I've had to move away from that. There was a period where that dipped and there was a period where I was quite insular and I had to work through that, but I've certainly not got that sense of myself or the people that I'm surrounded with now, so which I'm grateful for.
And yeah, no, that's so good to hear. Two kind of connected questions then, just before we wrap up. Do you expect anything to kind of come out of the public inquiry? What sort of state is that in right now? And like, what would you like to see come out of it, ideally?
Well, what I would like to see is, I would very much like to see a finding of institutional sexism. That is what we want. What I would like to see is people having their files disclosed to them. That is not happening. What I'd like to see is these officers not having anonymity. What I'd like to see is that this never happened to anyone else again. In terms of the amount of anonymity that is granted, that's not particularly helpful. I mean, it's called a public inquiry and it is quite far from being a public inquiry. It's not transparent. You know, it's big, it's unwieldy, it has so many layers of obfuscation. And even in terms of the files themselves, there's no good reason why I can't have a copy of my file. I've got to wait until I give evidence to have a copy of my file. But it's there, and Carlo will have had it. You know, the officers or ex-officers will have had the files. But yet we've got to wait until something like 6 weeks before we actually give evidence to get our files, which is insane. And the other thing that I find completely crazy is that, you know, the Met went in when they knew the public inquiry was going to happen. They went in and shredded a load of files. That's what they did. That was their response. But MI5 had all of them. So they were still there, but MI5 had them. So now, you know, we're in this kind of ludicrous situation where the Met have to go and ask for things from MI5. It's just, and you couldn't make that stuff up, could you? I mean, how could I, you know, small town girl, me, how could I ever think I'd be sitting there going, well, yes, my file is actually with MI5 because the Met shredded it. Not that I should ever have had a file in the first place, but there you go. But we need that disclosure. And it's another kind of, it's another cruelty on top of cruelty to not allow that, because we don't know what's said about us. We don't know what lies are written about us. We do not know how we're described. And I'm going to assume in advance that a lot of it will be quite horrible and quite upsetting come the time. So I'm going to really steel myself for that, have a lot of mental spinach for that before it happens, because it's not going to be pleasant. That period is not going to be good. But it has to be institutional sexism. There's no other way. And I suppose you say, what comes out of it? Well, it's not transparent. It's very unwieldy. But every time we have hearings, you know, the tree gets a little bit more shaken and things fall. and little nuggets of truth fall. And those bits, they all, you know, they're like little acorns, you bring them all together and you start to see more of the picture. So it's hard work. And there are some very brilliant people who do that stuff. You know, researchers, academics, activist researchers, they're all good with that stuff. That's not really my that's not my strength or my forte, but they go through everything and they put it together and they make the links. And then you just start to see how, you know, how absolutely corrupt the institution actually is, and how this idea that they were in any way rogue or that they were in any way a few bad apples, well, that's just blown right out of the water. And we know that. And we know that not just in relation to spy cops, but right across the Met Police itself.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight and for sharing all of this and for writing this story. And it's an incredible book. It's incredible to read your voice in amongst all of this obfuscation and deception, and you write with such brilliant kind of immediacy and honesty, and it's just been like an absolute revelation to have your voice coming out kind of through all of this. So thank you so much for joining us.
Can I just say to everyone who's there, obviously I can't see you, but we will be going back into hearings in May. So if you can follow Police Spies Out of Lives, Cops Campaign, and just the hashtag Spy Cops on Twitter will find you, everybody. We're all there. So if you follow us, and please give us your support for the next round of hearings and onwards. So we're going to be here for another little while. It's going to be a few years yet, but really lovely to be here. And thank you so much for having me tonight.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who's joined us this evening. We have more events coming up at Houseman's. We've actually got a few more things planned to do with surveillance and policing, because that is a recurring theme that we seem to not be able to get away from. But meanwhile, we'll see you in the shop. We'll see you online. And thank you so much for joining us. And thank you so much, Donna.
Thank you. I'll see you soon. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.